All right, high performers, welcome back in or welcome in for the first time. Thanks for joining us. I'm here with Dr. Adam Wright, and this particular segment, we're going to be diving into the second of sort of our 7 subcomponents of antifragility. So just if you're joining us for the first time or you need to dive into some of these different subcomponents that we're referring to, we'll nudge you to go check out the main podcast where we lay out what we mean by antifragility, how that breaks down into different components, and simple ways to kind of think about that and keep that centered in your mind. So today we're dealing with a second of the 7. Last time we talked about attention and awareness. This time we're going to deal with the issue of optimal motivation. A lot of different theories out there in terms of motivation. We're going to really focus on kind of one line of research, which is intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, or what would fall under the umbrella of self-determination theory. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but we're also going to put it into really 2 contexts for you as these high performers. One is sort of the personal, if you will, right? What are the implications of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation on your stress, on your burnout, on your well-being, on your performance, on your satisfaction? But also, if you happen to be somebody who's in a leadership position and responsible for other people or a team or organization of some type, how can you maybe think about some of these subcomponents in ways that'll enhance their particular type of motivation, which is predictive of things like engagement and fulfillment and satisfaction at work and those types of important outcomes, right? So we'll be digging into all of that, but first and foremost, let's start with our big why. Adam, why have motivation as one of our 7 kind of core components of antifragility?
In the most simplistic way, we need to understand what drives us, what fuels our behavior and moves us toward our goals.
Okay. So awareness and attention, what drives our behavior, right? What moves us towards our goals? Nice connection to our previous segment on awareness and attention as well. Let's break down kind of these simple definitions of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, or drive, if you will, for the audience.
External motivation just refers to engaging in activity to attain some kind of external reward or an outcome, right? To avoid, to gain pleasure or to avoid pain effectively. And intrinsic is the opposite. It's desire to engage in an activity because it's interesting or enjoying or inherently satisfying in and of itself.
Great. Okay. So extrinsic, right? Mostly carrot and stick, somewhat compliant, somewhat coming from some other source other than the self. Intrinsic, really driven by primarily the self. There's some sense of self-concordance or alignment, right? There's a desire in some way, shape, or form to do the thing. So for our audience, listen, the truth of the matter is it's not one or the other. It's a both and. Okay? And so we can think of like the simplest examples, and this is really important to understand. Do you want yourself to be primarily intrinsically driven? Do you want your potential employees or teammates to be primarily intrinsically driven? Like, we can get into that in just a minute. We'll make some arguments around that, but the simple idea is this: like, most people are working because of an extrinsic driver, right? Which in this case is money and all the things that comes with that, right, in terms of lifestyle. So like, it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's about understanding them both and being able to kind of be nimble and leverage them in different ways.
I think this is a good point. I think we have to understand that extrinsic motivation can actually promote well-being and resilience.
Right.
Providing these external resources and support, like financial rewards, that can help. That can help us cope with stress. That kind of feedback and mentoring can help us deal with adversity. But on the flip side, it could decrease resilience and motivation when we're relying on external outcomes too much, or it's based upon some kind of controlled regulation where we lose a sense of self or autonomy, or it's purely just like to avoid punishment, almost out of fear.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very, for lack of a better phrase, pure extrinsic motivation. They're not all equal. We cover that in the main podcast. There's actually 4 different subtypes of extrinsic motivation. But yeah, in that sort of purest form, there's really no alignment, really no sense of autonomy or internalization, not much caring, not much valuing about the task. It is really purely just to get that reward or avoid that punishment. And in the leadership scenario, if you see that amongst your people or your team, I mean, look out. Like, this is going to be highly predictive of workplace dissatisfaction, of burnout, of rates of departure, turnover rates. That's going to have all sorts of financial implications. But then really the opposite tends to be true as well, that if you happen to have a culture, a team where you can sort of promote the sense of intrinsic motivation, which, by the way, these things can be social contagions as well, right? Where there's interesting studies showing that teachers spread their type of motivation to students in some cases. But if it's intrinsic motivation, then typically you and your people have some sense of alignment or autonomy, and we'll break these down in just a moment, have some sense of connection and community and belonging and a desire to improve the various things that you have to do in the course of a day, right? Okay, so before we get into kind of those 3, components of intrinsic motivation, we've broken down each one. We've talked about basic definitions. On the personal side, right? So we just mentioned the leadership side. On the personal side, how might our listeners better leverage simple extrinsic motivators, like you said, to help with stress or help them perform or be resilient or whatever it might be?
Let me add one more point to this, because I think this is a helpful frame when we're looking for these things, is that we get caught up in the source of motivation a little too much. And I think what we have to understand is it's the quality of the motivation that really matters. So when we're thinking of these things, we're thinking about, okay, what do I feel that I need to really support my basic psychological needs? Are they being satisfied by this? So am I engaging in activities, people, things that are meaningful inherently to me? And if I can find those things, sometimes externally, sometimes intrinsically, I'm going to be likely to be more motivated over time.
Sure. So when it comes to higher quality, if you will, extrinsic motivation, what do you think are some good strategies?
I think partly is creating and seeking out a supportive culture. So I think it's important to have a workplace environment where we feel respected, where we feel like there's inherent collaboration. I feel where there's open communication and safety is important, because that sense of external support is going to drive our intrinsic motivation. Yeah, and connected with that is having a system of constructive feedback. And it's regular, it's specific, it's actionable, but it's provided in a supportive manner. And I think what that does is it helps people understand their strengths and their areas of improvement. But overall, what does it foster? A sense of competence and opportunity for growth, a sense of autonomy that I can make the changes necessary to be better.
Yeah. And kind of dovetailing on that autonomy piece, and again, it's not just purely intrinsic or extrinsic, but if we talk about autonomy but stay with extrinsic, on the personal level, like, there has to be some autonomy in deciding what your extrinsic motivators, right, consequences or rewards might be. So just stepping back and really asking, I think, a couple of questions. What are rewards and potential accountability or punishment that are going to drive me to do the thing I need to do, right? Number 2, how do I chunk those or scale those so I don't give myself too much of the reward too early, right? We want to kind of layer out or breadcrumb that dopamine, right, and that norepinephrine throughout the process of trying to accomplish a goal, right? That's what I would say on the personal side. On the leadership side, right, on the team organizational side, this is, I think, a really interesting question. Again, coming back to autonomy, how do I involve my team or my people in figuring out what individual or collective rewards or punishments should be at play for our performance, for the way we interact with each other, right? Those things might still be extrinsic, but they are somewhat autonomously opted into, going back to your point later. There's some sense of choice and involvement in that. And so you might find in a team setting, people are going to opt for cash bonuses, or they're going to opt for some different sort of benefits plan, or maybe more, personal days or whatever it might be. But I think finding a way to leverage extrinsic motivators that still are somewhat sourced intrinsically is a good way to go.
Yeah, I even think in terms of looking at recognition and rewards. While of course bonuses are important, promotions are important, but also things like verbal recognition is important in creating opportunities for further education or meaningful career advancement.
Yep.
All these things will support intrinsic motivations rather than undermine them over time.
And they'll tell you. You don't have to have all the answers of the whole menu. Just like talk to your people, right? And they'll tell you. And to your point earlier, if you have that trust and psychological safety for that open sort of dialogue, I think a lot of good things can happen there.
And also, by the way, it's like encouraging participation in this decision-making process is part of it too, right?
Yeah.
Because that's affecting the underlying conditions, and that involvement is going to strengthen their sense of autonomy and investment in those outcomes.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I'll give a shout out to a podcast, Making's Positive Psychology Work, Dr. Michelle McQuaid. I listened to an episode years ago where she had on a guest that really kind of drew a relationship between self-determination theory. So we're going to go into it right now. Let's just talk about the three components, right? So autonomy, which we've just gone over a little bit, competence, and relatedness. And her guest basically made the argument that psychological safety kind of can layer on to these core needs as well, right? And so that actually, in an organizational setting, some of the best ways to create the trust that can allow everything we're talking about here is by taking approaches that satisfy individuals' kind of core self-determined needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, right? Like it's a long way of saying these things are mutually reinforcing. Okay, so then getting into intrinsic motivation, we talked about autonomy. It's really either self-directedness, or internalization, like alignment. There's some sense of choice or at least willingness to engage with the thing. It's not purely out of compliance or for reward, right? We've talked about different ways you might manipulate that for your team. In terms of personally dealing with autonomy, do you have any kind of strategies you like to recommend?
I think you have to, number one, and what I see in type A people is they're not very good at celebrating their personal achievements. And what I mean by that, once you feel that you can celebrate milestones, improvements, regardless of outcomes, I think it drives you to be a better advocate for yourself. So as you support yourself and celebrating your competence, you give yourself more power to advocate and communicate the needs and preferences that you have within the team itself. And I think I see this so much in terms of like the best cultures that I see have training methods in place, they have schedules in place, they have well-being strategies in place that continue to celebrate, so that builds that drive to say, you know what, here's what I need to feel more connected. Here's what I need in the next job to feel more creative. Here's what I need to find more balance in my life, because right now what's important to me is I need to be home a little bit more because of the situation with my son or daughter.
So this is where something like work crafting or job crafting is a good example of autonomy, right? Do you have the capacity to have a conversation with the team, with the organization, with the boss, with whoever you report to, whatever it is, to see if you can create more places in whatever it is, your schedule, your priorities, right? Have some choice, have some self-directedness in a way that I think not only potentially helps your levels of well-being or burnout or whatever it might be, but in my experience, when that level of autonomy and trust is also granted to somebody, it tends to enhance the relationship in the sense, I think, of sometimes commitment or contribution to the giving party, if you will, in that case. So I think it can often be a win-win. But the other thing I was going to mention, just on a very personal side, is keep in mind, like, autonomy is not always just self-directedness. It is a sense of self-directedness or a sense of internalization. And so what I'm alluding to here is I do think sometimes perception can play a part in whether we think something is autonomous or not. And so that's a long way of saying sometimes the way you approach things and the internal dialogue you have about it is going to impact your sense of motivation or volition to do the thing. And so possessing skills, and this is where psychological flexibility, right, and framing and perspective taking comes in. But sometimes taking the approach and looking hard to find ways why that task or that experience is relevant or useful, right, or practical in some way for your life, I think you can sometimes convince yourself, oh yeah, this, like this is worth doing, and that can sometimes be the motivational push over the edge.
And yeah, and this is from a leadership perspective too, like making people realize that creating meaningful work is important. So ensuring that your employees really understand how their work is contributing to the larger organizational goals and the values, and linking those roles right to the bigger picture enhances intrinsic motivation and a personal investment in completing the tasks effectively.
Okay, so there's the connection to actually our third component. So let's go down to that, which is purpose. Talk a little bit more about what you just said, linking employees, what they're doing to the ultimate kind of outcomes, and why that connects to something like purpose.
People need to understand that their work matters. And through their work, what that means is that they matter. And part of that is understanding who's in front of you, part of that's understanding their needs, and then taking the time to explain how they're valued as human beings, because that will feed their sense of purpose and obviously their investment in the tasks that you're asking them to do.
And on the personal side, this is critical for you, the performer, as well, because if you don't have that sense of purpose, or that values alignment is another way to think about it, that is one of the more significant predictors over the course of time of burnout. Like, maybe the pay is fine, maybe you like the people you're working with, and that's enough to sort of mitigate. But if you don't feel good about the work you're doing or the contribution you're making, or that you're making and then thereby the company organization is making, that's psychic resistance. That's psychic friction on some level, and a sense of incoherence that can really kind of needle at somebody over the course of time.
And one of the most insidious aspects of burnout, if you look at it as a definition, is really this loss of agency, this loss of self. Right? That's really, to me, one of the most problematic aspects, even beyond the physical aspect of burnout, is a loss of self and sense of that self-effectiveness.
Well, there's maybe a good bridge into the third and final component of intrinsic motivation here, which is competence. Right? Talk about the relationship between confidence and efficacy and motivation.
Competence is an essential drive. Right? What we need to do in the world is to feel that we are capable and effective, and that we can move towards our value-based goals. And once that's lost, you lose a real sense of yourself. So the more we can build it internally by the decisions we make, and as a leader to create an environment where competence is not only rewarded, but there's an environment where one can see and celebrate their small successes, so that they build and their sense of competence is constantly improving.
Yeah. So on the leadership side, it's clear tasks, clear skills to develop, clear processes to the best of your ability to do it, right? And creating appropriate challenges that are achievable but difficult. And really, it's the same thing on the personal side as well, right? Finding things that are meaningful to pursue, meaningful to take on in difficult ways, and then breaking those difficulties down into small chunks that seem more tangible and doable, and then ideally falling in love with doing that process over and over and over again, right?
Supported, yes, and supported with constructive feedback that's created in a supportive culture with respect and collaboration, where mistakes are allowed to be made, perhaps even rewarded, so that there's a lack of fear and one can engage ultimately with more intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. For stuff about deliberate practice and competence, you check out Anders Ericsson and his book Peak. For stuff about purpose, there's The Invisible Leader and Zach Mercurio. There's Conscious Capitalism by John Mackey, formerly of Whole Foods, and Raj Sisodia. There's The Economics of Higher Purpose. For more on motivation and this theory in general, Dan Pink, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. But all of these different books, podcasts, talks, whatever, it can be accessed via the almanac, available for free on our website as well. So go ahead and check that out, and it'll give you simple access. Thanks for joining us for another segment on how to use some of these core components of anti-fragility to help you in your kind of high performance pressure executive roles. See you next time.